Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Be Well with Dr. Stockwell. I'm Dianna Klein, your host for this evening. We have the privilege of having Dr. Liz Lyster on with us tonight. She is simply amazing. She's an OBGYN by trade. However, in this stage of her career, she has pivoted away from that practice and she is now a specialist helping men and women with hormonal changes throughout life. She is also a chronic fatigue specialist and has a plethora of information to share with us about chronic fatigue, which I don't know about you guys, but I know me, I am always in some state of fatigue. So without further ado, let's tune in and listen to Dr. Liz Lyster. Hi, Dr. Lyster. Good evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us here on Be Well with Dr. Stockwell. How are you tonight with all this
Uh,
going on in our world?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Excellent.
Never a dull moment, that's for sure.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And you're joining us from the Bay Area, is that correct?
Yes,
Excellent,
yes, San
excellent.
Francisco, the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, your area of expertise is extremely fascinating. And I know a lot of our listeners are in that perimenopausal phase of life, as well as many either encroaching upon menopause or are already in menopause. And I know that menopause in and of itself is something that we just really don't talk a whole lot about. And then adding in another big vocabulary word for we lay people is the perimenopause phase. And I know you have done extensive research and spent a very large part of your career in that space and treating patients in that chapter of life. Can you just kind of tell our listeners kind of just basic definitions of perimenopause, menopause, and then I'm very curious as well about andropause, which is the men in our life, what they go through as well, and some of the parallels that they go through compared to what we go through.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting, a little bit different. The way I like to break it down to make it easy is menopause is once a woman completely stops having her period. That's sort of clear, easy to understand. So for women who go through surgery, have their uterus removed, then it's surgical menopause and they're done with periods. Or more typically is women going into it more naturally, average age of 51 in the US at least, and then they're done. Okay? So that's menopause.
Gotcha.
I use that interchangeably with postmenopause. That's the same. Then there's premenopause. And premenopause is when everything's just marching along pretty hunky dory, regular menstrual periods, the cycle's pretty normal, woman's feeling pretty good in general, the cycle's not misbehaving. All right, so that's what I call premenopause. And then there's this time in between, which is perimenopause. Peri as in perimeter, like around menopause. And it can last a long time. That's the remarkable part, is that we can be looking at 10 or more years from when things were marching along super normal until the periods completely stop. Can be this long stretch where all kinds of fun things can happen.
Mm, interesting. Okay. So premenopause would be, or pretty much someone like me, age 38, cycle is normal, month to month, no issues, things clicking along just fine.
That's what I would call premenopause.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, this perimenopause, so that's fascinating to me. How would someone like myself know that I am approaching that phase?
The first hormone that tends to decline, and this is really common for women in their 30s, is progesterone. Progesterone helps us feel calm, it helps us sleep. So, a lot of women start to have some sleep disruption, some mood changes. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors who don't understand the hormonal changes that are happening will they'll give what I call band aid medications like sleeping pills or antidepressants.
Mm,
Okay. But really what's happening is progesterone is starting to go down. So sleep disturbances, mood changes, shorter fuse, a lot of women describe it like that. And then estrogen can start to fluctuate. It can go down in some women, which affects mood. It can go up, which can give estrogen dominant symptoms like breast tenderness, headaches, all kinds of fun things can happen. And of course, disrupting the menstrual cycle in any way, heavier, lighter, further apart, closer together, all kinds of different changes. Those are the most common ones. Weight gain, fatigue. It's like this package deal that can happen at that point.
Well, I have two sons under the age of 3, and I thought I was blaming most of like the sleep disruption and the mood changes and the shorter fuse. I was kind of blaming it on them.
Sure, I would.
Oh my,
I would put the blame on that. No, I'm kidding. I mean, it could be. It could be. And that's
interesting.
very common. I see women of all ages with little kids, and also a lot of women. Let's see, you're going to be one of my women who's right around age 50 and teenagers.
Oh
Yeah.
yes. Oh yes. Absolutely. Yep. I was a later in life mom. Yep. I am going to have teenagers in my 50s. Yes.
It's common, super common now.
It is. It is
Yeah.
definitely. Definitely. Well, that's really fascinating. So perimenopause, and you talked about, you mentioned an increase in estrogen, and creating the tenderness in breasts and so forth. That's what can, aside from age, probably is maybe going to be your answer. But is there anything in our environment that can exacerbate that
Oh yeah.
causes this earlier?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I am seeing these changes happen earlier and earlier in women.
Oh
We
wow.
have all kinds of what we call endocrine disruptors in our lives now. Foods that we eat, pollution, um, just medications that we're put on, topical creams, lotions, makeup, full of all types of um, ingredients that are not necessarily the best for us. So that's what we call endocrine disruptors. And that's exactly what it sounds like, where it's just throwing off the hormone balance system.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, it's interesting. I see, and perhaps this is a little bit of my mother and me, and maybe I'm just becoming my mother. But she used to look around at young girls with the short shorts and everything and just scoff. And now I look around and I see so many young girls in their teenage years and early 20s that I'm thinking are overdeveloped and like developing at a
Right.
much higher rate. Is that is do you think that that's just me anecdotally looking at it? Do you think that perhaps these endocrine disruptors are causing that as well?
Yes, yes. No, that the data shows that girls are having their period at a younger age. Their increasing body fat can trigger puberty, and the food that we eat is just not as good a quality. The quality is declining. Our diets are not doing so well. And all of that, if it's leading to earlier weight gain and fat gain in particular, it can trigger the onset of puberty to happen a little bit earlier. And that we know that women don't grow as tall and get their menstruation at a younger age. We're definitely seeing that.
Wow, wow. What do you see are the implications for these young girls as they become women throughout life with an earlier onset menstrual cycle, and going forward in life? How does that change? Would that lead potentially to earlier menopause, later menopause?
You know, there isn't a good association between those. People observe, kind of make different observations, but there really isn't a very consistent pattern that we see. One suggestion is that if a girl goes into puberty younger, that she's going to go into menopause later, but that's really more anecdotal. That's not very consistent.
Sure.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And from a health standpoint, it depends on the choices that she makes all through her life.
True. True. Definitely. Definitely. So, hmm. Yeah, it's like how do you prevent that with our food and with everything? Complete environments around us are just seem to be very much against us and against this cause of trying to keep us healthy. What would you recommend to young girls in high school that are approaching this as much as they will listen? I know I didn't listen very well in high school, but
Right.
but if you could tailor some information or tailor a soundbite, if you will, to try to penetrate the minds of those young girls as far as what they can do for their health at that phase of life to prevent these issues that we're all seeing as we are older, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that the healthier that they can stay, the better choices they can make on a daily basis, that it adds up over the long run. If you don't put on your seatbelt on one quick trip to the store, most likely nothing bad will happen. But if you do that over a lot of years of your life, then chances are that yes, something bad will eventually at some point happen.
Right.
And
Right.
that's really what it's all about with making good choices on a daily basis. And I would say to young women of all ages, is to do do everything that you can so that you feel your best, so then you can then turn back around and do your best in your life and for other people.
Right. Right. Yeah, definitely. That's extremely good advice. Extremely good advice. Gosh. Um, one thing I noticed in your bio and your very extensive amount of research is you've done a lot of study with fatigue, and in my other job is I'm a pilot, and so fatigue is a big deal to us, and we have
Yeah.
specialized work rules and not just work rules but regulations, federal regulations that govern our sleep cycles or how much sleep we're supposed to have in a given period. And that's on the aviation operational side. But for your side, from all your research, you've done a ton of research on chronic fatigue. And we already talked about perimenopause and being tired and all of those things and how I'm equating it to being a mother of two toddlers. What would you, I mean, it seems like we are all pre COVID 19, we were all just tired. And now COVID 19, we're tired in a different way, depending on our walks of life, what is making us tired, what worries are on our hearts, and so forth. But overall, we are all a very tired society. Um, that chronic fatigue. Can you tell us a little bit about your research first? And then I'm going to ask you what advice you would have to give to all of us to avoid it. But I'm really curious, I think our listeners would be too, to hear about your research with chronic fatigue.
Oh my goodness, and this is like a huge topic. I
Yes.
tell you what, I'm really interested to know, how do they have in the pilot world, how many hours of sleep do they tell you that
We are
is makes
supposed
you safe?
we're supposed to have 8 hours of sleep behind the door. So as soon as we get into our hotel and we close that door, we are supposed to have 8 solid hours from the moment that we close that door. And if
Love
we
it.
don't, then we will actually delay flights the next day in order to make sure the crew is well rested. And then
Wow.
my specialty is long haul flying, and so we work in WACLs, windows of circadian lows, and we tailor our crew rest based on that cycle. And oftentimes we will fly to a destination, and instead of just staying for roughly 24 hours, we'll stay for 50 hours so that we become what they call acclimated, and then we wind up coming back and having to reacclimate. So it's very
Whoa.
much based on our circadian cycles.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Well, research for sleep shows all sorts of different basic sleep needs. There are only about 3% of us who can get along with fewer than, let's say, 5 hours of sleep a night. So when you hear about famous people who don't need to sleep a lot, that exists. However, I'm in the 97% of people who do not have that genetic gift. And most studies agree that 7 hours is a really rock bottom minimum. So I'm happy to hear that people who are piloting our aircraft are required to hopefully be getting a little bit more than that. So in terms of quantity, we want to get minimum 7 hours of sleep, and of course, many people need more than that. Okay.
Right.
Now, as far as what people describe as chronic, for example, chronic fatigue syndrome has a lot more. It has the sleep disruption, it has the feeling of a profound fatigue, and patients actually distinguish it from once we get them feeling better, they distinguish that feeling from what they call quote unquote normal tired.
Hmm.
Okay, so there's normal tired. There's your little ones kept you up. You know that you're working long hours. You know reasons for being tired. And then if you're hopefully able to get away on a trip somewhere and you can really rest up, and then you don't have this ongoing feeling of severe fatigue. So there is a difference. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And people with chronic fatigue syndrome have other disturbances in their bodies. They have muscle pain. They have, which can affect all kinds of systems in the body, by the way, um, as well as cognitive issues. Okay, so it's kind of got this own set of symptoms going together. And it's distinct from, like I said, from what people and myself refer to kind of like normal tired.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So if someone were to come to you, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know you're an OBGYN by trade, but you've done a ton of work in this area. Do you have a
Right.
separate practice that helps people with chronic fatigue? Do you, for example, would you have a chronic fatigue practice and then your OBGYN practice separate?
Yeah, now it's all together, and I am not delivering babies anymore. I gave that up a few years ago, even though it was fun. And
Yes.
I'm actually not doing the gynecology itself now. My
Okay.
practice is completely a consultative practice. And I do my very favorite part of what I always did as a doctor over the last 30 years, which is I spend most of my time talking with women.
Awesome.
It's
Awesome.
my favorite part. In medical school, it's what drew me to OBGYN. And so I enjoyed all that time that I was in the operating room and doing surgeries and delivering babies and C-sections and backing up midwives and doing all sorts of fun things. However, over time, I would say over the past 13 years or so, kind of narrowed down my practice, and now it's entirely focused on hormone balance, menopause, perimenopause, low thyroid, fatigue, energy, weight gain. Those are my favorite topics, and I get to spend most of my time talking, sometimes with men. A lot of fun to talk to the men. They're usually easier to get them feeling better. We
I bet.
women are more complicated, but most of my time talking with women, which is my favorite part.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what? Shame on me. That was one of my first questions that I wanted to ask you during our podcast is what got you into women's health? Like why women's health? And when you were in medical school, what was, it's my understanding you guys go through all types. You see everything and you're all general
We do.
practitioners and then you all typically specialize in one way or another. What drew you to women's health?
First of all, both my parents are doctors.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was around medicine and the medical world my whole life, and I always enjoyed it. I would go visit my parents at the hospital. My mom's a pediatrician, my dad's a neurologist. They're both mostly retired, but they're still active in their communities. My mom still works part-time,
Oh,
and now she's learning how to do Zoom online telehealth consultation.
oh gosh, I bet.
I know, she's multi-talented. Okay, so I was always around that. I always enjoyed it, liked going to the hospital, liked the environment, did summer jobs in the hospitals, that type of thing. Then I got to medical school, and you get to go on rotations and you get to shadow the resident doctors. I'll never forget one day I was there as a student and I was following the senior resident as she was going in to see a patient in the clinic. And this patient was having hot flashes and sweats. She was having menopause related symptoms. And I just sat in the corner and observed like a little fly on the wall. And what I observed was this doctor talking with the patient. And just in the process of their conversation, the patient was just feeling so relieved that this was normal and that she could do something to help her feel better. And just in the course of their conversation, the patient was feeling better and was really happy. And that's exactly what I wanted to do.
Awesome. Awesome. Oh, that's really cool. That is really cool.
It
And
was great.
just like you said now with your consulting business, that's what you're doing. You're talking to
Hmm.
women and getting them so much healthier. That's wonderful. We mentioned earlier before I backtracked and asked you about how you got into medicine. You mentioned that you also talked to the men as well, and I'm presuming you consult and talk to them about their hormone balances and imbalances, and this new term that I am not that familiar with called andropause. Can you tell us about that? Because menopause, we hear that buzzword often, and sometimes in a not so great light, but very rarely do we hear about andropause. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The word andropause is interesting. I think it's great that there is a word. It's not exactly the right word because with menopause, meno refers to the menstrual cycle. And of course, as people comment on the internet and make jokes about the fact, I don't know why they call it a pause because it's really a full stop. Okay,
Right.
so for women, we go through this very big up and down year or two transition. The hormone levels are going up, down, up, down. I call it the stock market phase because that's what the graph looks like, the levels like wildly going up and down as a woman. And then she goes into menopause and everything's low. For men, it's a much more gradual process. Okay, so you've got a young man, his young men, young women, we're teenagers, we're around age 20, our levels are at their very highest. Okay, and then we go through our 20s. And then for men, around starting around age 30, their testosterone levels go down 1 to 2% every year.
Wow.
I know.
I would have never guessed. Interesting.
Exactly. And they don't guess it either. So they're going, so just picture a more gradually declining curve. And when you take it all the way out to a man who's in his 70s, 80s, or older, the stereotype of the crabby old man, the grumpy old man,
Yes.
that's not because, people think testosterone makes you angry. It doesn't. It actually calms you down. And so the grumpy old man is actually lacking testosterone.
Oh, interesting.
And
Interesting.
that's when men get sick, when they get older, right? Women as well. When we have lower hormone levels in our bodies, that's when things get difficult and we start to experience more illnesses.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
hmm
Well, I learned something new. I would have never guessed
Mhm.
that. The 1 to 2% and then the grumpy old man makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever heard of the story of the boiling frog?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay,
yes.
right. So it's not a very pretty story, but as you know, the boiling frog, the frog, if you toss it into boiling water, it jumps right out, right?
Right. Right.
But if it's just in the room temperature water and you heat it slowly, it doesn't realize it till it's too late. And it's more like that for men. All of a sudden
Okay.
they're tired, they're not motivated, they might be gaining weight, they might be losing muscle mass, and that's the constellation of symptoms that's referred to as andropause.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, and of course that I'm envisioning like a graph in my mind, and one line on the graph is we women. Everything is starting to kind of taper off down towards perimenopause and then menopause, and then the gentlemen in our life have the decreasing testosterone. That and then the confluence of that is not a good thing. So
Right.
that could create some angst, if you will. Now it makes sense. Interesting. So when if a let's go back to women here for just a few minutes.
Yeah.
um, if a woman comes to you who has all of these negative symptoms and they say, Dr. Lister, what, help me please, and let's say that they're in the perimenopause phase. So the sleep deprivation, the mood changes, the shorter fuse, the weight gain, or some of the things, increase in estrogen causing breast tenderness and so forth. I'm sure, I know it varies from patient to patient, but typically, what are your go-to things? What's going through your mind as far as how can you help a woman who comes to you with those things? Is it through supplementation? Is it through estrogen, synthetic estrogen supplements? Like what do you typically prescribe to these women or recommend?
Yeah, yeah, that's an awesome question. What I do, what my process starts with is a really thorough evaluation. That's step number one. So, not just looking at just a couple of blood tests that her doctor may or may not run for her. A lot of times, if a woman tells her doctor she's still having her period, they'll say, oh, well, this is not related to hormones or menopause, so I'm not going to check you. That happens a lot. So, the first step is a really thorough workup: thyroid, adrenals, the sex hormones, vitamin levels, regular labs, cholesterol, looking at the whole picture. And then in terms of getting her feeling better, depending on what the results show, it's going to include natural supplements. There's almost always that's going to be part of the program. And also the natural, or I like the word bioidentical forms of the hormones.
Okay.
Okay, so replenishing back into the body what we used to have enough of back when we were feeling fantastic. Okay, so I don't subscribe to the theory that we have to have hormone levels of a 20-year-old. As I like to say, there's a reason we don't want 20-year-olds running things.
Right. Yes.
Okay. However, maybe like your age. Your age is
Maybe.
like
Right.
really great. You know, you're feeling good, you're keeping up with your littles, you're working, like you kind of got this whole wonderful groove going. And that's a nice place to stay. That's a nice place to be hormonally.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So is it typically, especially when it comes to hormones, and I've had a few guests on the podcast previously that talked about a little bit about the bioidentical versus the synthetic estrogen. But before we delve into that, another question just came up in my mind. With the bioidentical estrogen, is it typically something that a woman, let's say I come to you at 38 years old and you diagnose me as perimenopausal, and to combat my symptoms, you prescribe bioidentical estrogen. Is it a regimen of 3 months, 6 months, a year, or is it something that I would have to take throughout the rest of my life? But then, how does that, if that's the case, then how does that impact menopause?
Excellent question. It's actually one of the first questions that I get before women look at me. They're like, okay, wait, I really want to do things to feel better, but first tell me, how long will I be having to take this?
Right.
So that's a
Yes.
very common question. All right. So I have a kind of a range of answers there. One is that, first of all, I encourage women not to be in a rush to get off of hormones. I like to have them, number one, feel better and then get to feeling great and then stay there a while. Okay. Depending on her age, when we start, saying at least a few years. Okay. Hormones are good for the bones, they're good for the brain. There are so many benefits that I'm aware of doctors who have the patient sign a consent form if they don't want hormones
Oh, wow.
because there's so many adverse health changes that happen once our hormone levels go down. Okay, so the other part of my answer is that the amount of hormones that it takes to protect the brain and the heart and the bones in particular is much less than what it takes to clear up hot flashes and night sweats.
Huh.
So the amount of hormone replenishment that a younger woman might need who's suffering and not sleeping well and doesn't want to have sex with her partner and is being mean to her kids and is, important situations to improve and clear up, the amount of hormone replenishing that requires is more than what she'll need in the long run.
Okay. Gotcha. So it's one of those situations where obviously coming back in and checkups with you on a rather routine basis to reevaluate and make sure things
Exactly.
are still going as they should. Okay. Excellent.
Exactly. And the visits get further apart. I don't like to go more than 6 months without check-ins with my patients. And because all my years of doing gynecology, I would see women once a year and we would set goals and I'd see them a year later and there wasn't even a check-in during the year, just to be sure that things were on track. So every 6 months is what I call cruise control mode. Once a woman is doing well, feeling good, and then in between, if we need to make adjustments, we do. But so at first, it's a little more intensive. Like the first year, there's a few more appointments in that year, but then later on the visits, we go into more of a monitoring mode.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And kind of back to the original, my original question that popped into my brain, the bioidentical form versus
Yeah.
synthetic.
Yes.
We laypersons, we hear estrogen supplementation equated with some negative. You talked about all the positive things, and I've learned so much through doing this podcast and speaking to experts such as yourself that it is absolutely a positive for a woman's life. But yet, oftentimes in the media or on social media or Dr. Google says that synthetic estrogen or estrogen in general supplementation can cause awful things such as an increased risk of breast cancer and some other things. Um, do you mind talking a little bit about that specifically? And I hear it regarding synthetic estrogen. So am I completely off base or
You
not?
are not off base whatsoever. as I like to say, and as I heard said, bad news makes better news than good news.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that bad news has just hung around since 2002, since the Women's Health Initiative study. And that's where that whole idea came from, where they used estrogen by mouth. We're going to come right back to that, and not bioidentical. And they used a synthetic, or let's say non bioidentical progestin. Okay. And we know now that that's the source of the increased risk of breast cancer is the synthetic progestin, not the estrogen.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
we
Okay.
just know that for sure. There's multiple large studies, including the original that Women's Health Initiative study, because they only stopped the arm of the study where women were taking the estrogen, the horse estrogen, and the non-bioidentical progestin. They stopped that arm, but there's a whole nother arm of thousands of women of the study who were continued to be given the estrogen. Again,
Oh,
not the one I like. This is a horse oral estrogen.
oh,
They were given, and then another group in that arm given placebo. The women on the estrogen had a lower risk of breast cancer.
wow.
I know, but they had other issues because it was oral estrogen. So we want
Sure.
estrogen through the skin,
Okay.
and we want the progesterone to be bioidentical. So progesterone can be by mouth, but it has to be bioidentical in order to avoid the increased risk of breast cancer and other issues that they found in that study.
Interesting. Okay, this is the
Hmm.
first I've heard of the estrogen by mouth versus estrogen um, in the
Yes,
skin.
very important.
And
Hmm.
horse estrogen, that's what it was?
Yes, it was called Premarin, which was short for pregnant mare's urine.
Oh
I
goodness.
know, just not a good drug on so many levels. Now, I will say that it helped a lot of women feel better, but we now know that oral estrogen does what we call the first pass effect through the liver. You swallow it, goes in your stomach, and then it absorbs and goes over to the liver and stimulates the production of clotting factors. And so these women in this study with oral estrogen had increased risk of strokes, heart attacks, other outcomes that none of us want, which
No.
we now know that those risks are not elevated when the estrogen is through the skin.
Interest
Cream, patch, vaginal application, hormone pellet therapy, anything other than by mouth.
Interesting. Okay, so it essentially bypasses a major digestive system and has a completely different result. That's fascinating.
Exactly. It really is. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors still aren't up to speed with all that information. So I always say to women that they have to be the tail that wags the dog, to
Yes.
advocate for themselves. Hmm.
Wow, interesting. Okay. Well, I know our listeners will definitely want to hear about that. And oh my goodness, Premarin standing for what it stands for with pregnant mare's urine, estrogen.
Urine, yes.
Oh, wow.
Ew, right? I know.
Wow. Is that even still on the market?
It is.
What?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it
Wow.
sure is. It's the cheapest one now.
Oh,
It's
geez.
been
Well, that's
around for
interesting.
so long. I know.
Huh. Wow. Big red flag. Big red flag.
Yeah,
Premarin. No.
yeah,
Premarin
yeah.
equals no. Okay.
Yes,
Wow.
yeah. So a lot of the patches, the gels, they're bioidentical. They count. They are bioidentical. They are great. They help women feel better, and they don't cause all those other issues that we saw in those studies.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, thank goodness there's an alternative. It sounds like several different alternatives that are
Yeah,
healthy and safe. Wow. Wow. Fascinating. Oh,
yeah.
well, we're almost out of time. And before we go, I have two big things. The first thing, I noticed you're an author. And I also, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about your online community, which, I mean, in this day and age of COVID-19 quarantine and what I foresee in the future is being a lot more online based access of things to people. You are starting an online community. Can you tell us a little bit about your online community?
Absolutely. It's growing, and I'm about to do surveys and kind of ask people. I have ideas of what I want to name the baby, what I want to name it,
Oh,
but that'll
cool.
be kind of a group activity. And basically, it's people who want to feel great at every age. People who, as I like to say, reject the J word, as in just. You're just getting older. You just have to accept feeling more tired or less sex drive with your relationship. That's just not true.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Okay.
And the
Okay.
just is another four-letter word too.
There
So
you go. There you
that
go.
that
Yeah.
awful
So,
J, four-letter J
yeah.
word.
Yeah, so my first book is really about perimenopause, even though it's called Dr. Liz's Easy Guide to Menopause. It's really aimed at women in their 40s and 50s who are still having ups and downs and want to get that dialed in. And my book that came out last year and went bestseller is called Go for Great, Dr. Liz's Guide to Thrive at Every Age.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Those are definitely going on my reading list. Are you selling via Amazon or Audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are on Amazon. They are on, signed copies are on my website. I created a video course that goes along with the Dr. Liz's Easy Guide to Menopause. And I love that class. It's just a wonderful 7 short sessions, adds up to about an hour of videos. And that's currently for free for people joining my online community on my website.
Awesome. Awesome. And what's your website?
drlizmd.com, drlizmd.com.
MD.com. Awesome. Awesome. drlizmd.com. Excellent. And as far as social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those, do you have a handle that we can find you at as well?
Absolutely. All of that is on my website. Most
Per-
of them are Dr. Liz Lister, DrLizLyster. That's always an easy way to find me.
Perfect. Perfect.
The links are definitely on my site. I
Awesome.
want everybody to connect. I love being connected. I love growing that. I put out content every day
That's
to
great.
keep people up to date and links to all the information that's out there. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So just to make sure I've got it recapped, it's Dr. Liz's Easy Guide to Menopause, which is not just menopause, but covers perimenopause and all of we ladies that are approaching that stage of life. And then your other book, Go for Great, which sounds amazing. Both sound amazing. Available on Amazon, on Audible, and also via your website, drlizmd.com, drlizmd.com. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, one last question before we go. This, first of all, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Lister. This has really been very eye opening. Lots of interesting things I've learned tonight that are just kind of a little shocking and stunning in a good way. The whole Premarin and talking about the men's health aspect of this too has been really fascinating. But one last closing thought. What advice would you give to your closest female friend or a daughter or a close female relative and ors to all of those or all of the above? What would you tell them is the one big thing that you have seen in your practice through all your years of medicine that you can do to help be the best that you can be at any stage of life?
I would say to be proactive. Go ahead, get ahead of the game. Don't tolerate not feeling your best. There are safe ways to balance hormones, replenish hormones. Don't be afraid. Go for it. Do not hang around not sleeping well and not feeling good because you think that there's health risks with the hormone replenishment, because there aren't. There's actually a vast list of health benefits. So that's what I encourage. That's what I would encourage her to do is that, and take vitamin D. Vitamin D is our friend, and
Awesome.
also to go for it, to not be afraid of replenishing hormones, and really go for feeling great at every age.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lister. Again, really appreciate it.
My
And
pleasure.
please stay healthy and stay safe up there in the Bay Area.
Thank
And
you.
I cannot wait to hear about your online community. I'm definitely going to like and follow all of your social media and get tuned into your website. And I can't wait to see what you name the baby. of your online community.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Have a great night. Thank you again.